85 million people. That is how many Iranians are permitted, by law, to watch exactly one television network, one broadcaster, one signal, controlled since 1979 by the same government that controls everything else. You do not get a second channel. You do not get an independent voice. You get the Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, IRIB, and what IRIB decides reality looks like that evening. For 46 years, that has been enough. On the evening of June 18, 2025, at approximately 10:30 p.m. Tehran time, something appeared on Iranian state television that was not supposed to be there. Not a technical glitch, not a transmission error. Women, Iranian women, in the streets, marching. Footage that the Iranian government had spent 3 years officially erasing, classifying as foreign propaganda, as sedition, as evidence of an enemy that wanted to destroy the nation from within. The footage lasted seconds. Then the IRIB slate came back. Then the broadcaster issued a statement that was, by any measure, one of the most revealing things they could have said. If you experience disruptions or irrelevant messages while watching various TV channels, it is due to enemy interference with satellite signals. They confirmed the hack in the act of denying it. Somewhere, in an office with no windows facing anything identifiable, in a building that does not appear on any organizational chart published anywhere, a man was watching the same confirmation land in real time. He had not slept properly in 11 days. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, and he had not noticed. He was not celebrating. He was waiting to find out what they had just started. To understand what this operation was, you have to understand what it was not. It was not a cyber attack in the conventional sense. There were no servers breached, no passwords stolen, no malware deployed inside IRIB's systems. The studios in Tehran had already been struck physically. 2 days earlier, on June 16th, Israeli airstrikes, part of Operation Rising Lion, the most extensive Israeli military campaign against Iran in modern history. The studios were damaged. The staff had scattered. The institutional confidence of the broadcaster, the sense that the signal was sovereign, that what IRIB decided to transmit was what Iranians would receive, had already been shaken. What happened on June 18th was a satellite signal intercept. Someone, somewhere, pushed a transmission onto the same frequency that IRIB was using to reach residential satellite receivers across the country. They didn't need to be inside the building. They needed to be louder than it. For approximately 8 seconds, they were. The man in the office had been part of the team that spent 6 weeks arguing about whether to do this. Not the technical question. The technical question had been resolved early. The intercept was achievable. The signal window was identifiable. The delivery was clean. The argument was about something else entirely. In the history of psychological operations, the deliberate use of information as a weapon, there is a category of action that military ethicists call undirected influence. You send a message. You cannot control who receives it. You cannot control what they do with it. You cannot follow it into the rooms it enters. A bomb, in the terrible calculus of war, lands where it is aimed. A signal lands everywhere the satellite reaches. At 10:30 p.m. on a Wednesday in June, the satellite reached families. It reached elderly people watching the evening news. It reached children who were supposed to be asleep but weren't. It reached a man in Isfahan who had no connection to politics, who had voted in the last election for the candidate who seemed slightly less extreme, who was sitting in his living room when footage of banned protests appeared on his screen and a voice said, "Come out, take to the streets." The man in the office knew this. He had approved it anyway. What he did not know, what no one in the room had a clean answer for, was what happened to the man in Isfahan after he saw it. The operation existed inside a larger architecture that the Israeli government had been constructing for months. Operation Rising Lion was not primarily a military campaign in the traditional sense. It was designed as a multi-domain pressure event, a simultaneous degradation of Iran's physical capabilities, its economic systems, its information environment, and its internal political confidence. Israeli airstrikes had already hit radar installations, ballistic missile production sites, the Iraq nuclear reactor, the command infrastructure of the IRGC. On the same night as the television broadcast, a separate operation was underway against Bank Sipa and Nobitex, Iran's largest cryptocurrency exchange. Financial systems and broadcast systems disrupted in the same hours. The sequencing was a message in itself. First, the studios, then the signal. First, the physical broadcaster, then the transmission it no longer fully controlled. The theory was elegant. If you damage the institution, and then demonstrate that you can bypass the institution, reach past it, directly into the homes it was supposed to protect, you do not just degrade capability, you degrade belief. Belief that the government controls what you see. Belief that the signal is sovereign. Belief that the version of reality IRIB presents is the only version available. The man in the office believed the theory. What he could not model, what the 6 weeks of argument had never fully resolved, was how the people on the other end of the signal would process the collapse of that belief. Whether it would move them toward resistance or toward the government that was already telling them the disruption was proof of foreign aggression. Both outcomes were possible, simultaneously, depending on variables that no intelligence file could predict: the specific person watching, the specific moment, the specific combination of fear and anger and exhaustion, and hope that a decade of living under this government had produced in each of them individually. The operation treated them as a population. They were not a population. They were 85 million separate people. There is something else that the man in the office knew, which the official record of this period does not directly address. The broadcast carried a logo. Iranian opposition media identified it within hours, associated with what they called Lion's Awakening, the psychological operations component of Rising Lion. A visual signature, a mark. Signatures in intelligence operations serve a specific function. They are not vanity, they are communication. When you leave a signature, you are saying, "This was deliberate. This was us. We are capable of this, and we chose to use that capability here, now, for this purpose." The signature was aimed at the Iranian government, at the IRGC, at the security apparatus. It said, "We reached your people through your signal, and we put our name on it." But the signature also reached everyone else watching: the family in Tehran, the shopkeeper in Shiraz, the student in Mossad who had never heard of Lion's Awakening, and now, in the 12 seconds before the IRIB slate returned, was seeing a logo that meant something to someone, and did not know what. The man in the office had signed something. He had signed it for the IRGC generals, who would understand the signature immediately. He could not unsign it for everyone else. Netanyahu addressed the Iranian people during this period, directly. In a video message, in clear language, the regime has never been weaker. This is your opportunity to stand up and let your voices be heard. The message reached Iranians who had satellite access, or diaspora connections, or the specific kind of courage required to look for information their government did not want them to find. It did not reach them in a vacuum. It reached them inside a country where, at exactly this moment, the government was telling them that the airstrikes were an attack on Iran, not on the regime, on the country, on them, and that the people encouraging them to protest were the same people dropping bombs on their infrastructure. The man in the office had read the Prime Minister's statement. He had read it and thought about the man in Isfahan. He had thought about what it means to tell someone that their moment has arrived when you are the person who just bombed their city, and you are not the one who will be in the street when they act on it. He was still thinking about it. The coffee was cold. The confirmation from the Iranian broadcaster was sitting on his screen. The satellite had reached the living rooms. The footage had appeared. The message had transmitted. What he did not know, what no one in the room knew in the hours after, was whether anyone had gone outside. And if they had, who was waiting for them? The assumption everyone carried into the operation was that silence was neutral, that if you did nothing, if the satellite stayed quiet, if the signal remained sovereign, if IRIB's version of reality went uncontested, the people of Iran would simply continue in their existing condition. Oppressed, yes. Surveilled, yes. But stable, contained. Not endangered by something that came from outside. The assumption was wrong, and the man in the office knew it was wrong before the operation was authorized. He had argued it himself in the early sessions when the abort faction was loudest. What he had not fully reckoned with was what it meant to know the assumption was wrong and authorize the operation anyway, and then sit in the hours after, waiting to find out what the signal had released into a country he could not see inside. The abort discussion had happened 3 times. Not once, not as a formality. 3 separate sessions, over 6 weeks, in which the operational team genuinely confronted the possibility that the broadcast should not happen. The first session was technical. Could the signal be traced back to its source in real time? Could Iranian signals intelligence identify the uplink location before the transmission window closed? The answer was probably not. Probably. The second session was legal. Under what framework did a satellite signal intercept targeting a civilian broadcaster in a country with which Israel was in active, if undeclared, conflict, constitute a permissible act of war? The lawyers in the room produced language that satisfied the requirement. The man in the office had read it twice and understood that it satisfied the requirement the way that certain legal documents satisfy requirements, by being precise about what it said and very careful about what it did not say. The third session was the one that lasted longest. It was the session where someone put a question on the table that had no legal or technical dimension at all. The question was, what happens to the people who believe us? In the architecture of psychological operations, there is a category of casualty that does not appear in any official after-action report. They are not collateral damage in the kinetic sense. They are not in the blast radius. They are not within range of anything that detonates. They are the people who heard the message, who received the signal, who looked at the footage on their screen, the women marching, the banned images, the proof that the government had lied about what happened 3 years ago and felt something shift, and then acted on it. In a country where acting on that shift, walking to a window, saying something to a neighbor, writing 4 words on a piece of paper and leaving it somewhere, can result in arrest, detention, and in documented cases. Execution, the person who sent the signal carries a relationship to that outcome that has no clean name. Not responsible for it. Not innocent of it. Something in between, in a space that operational language was specifically designed to avoid occupying. The man in the office had sat with that question through the third session. He had not answered it. No one had. They had authorized the operation anyway, because the alternative, leaving the information environment entirely in the hands of a government that was, at that moment, preparing for the possibility of mass domestic unrest, carried its own weight. The man in the office had voted to proceed. He had done so knowing that he could not follow the signal. What the intelligence picture showed in the 72 hours after the June broadcast was not what the optimistic scenario had predicted. The optimistic scenario, which had been written into the operational brief and which the man in the office had read enough times to have memorized certain phrases, was that the broadcast would function as a visible crack. That Iranians would see footage of the 2022 protests appearing on a channel that had spent 3 years denying those protests existed, and that the cognitive dissonance would do a specific kind of work. It would make the lie visible. And once a lie is visible, once the mechanism of state deception is exposed not in the abstract, but in the living room, on the screen, in real time, the theory held that something in the population's relationship to the government would shift permanently. The 72-hour picture did not show that shift. It showed something more complicated and considerably more dangerous. It showed the Iranian government absorbing the broadcast into its existing narrative faster than the operational team had modeled. The IRIB statement, interference by the Zionist enemy, had gone out within minutes of the disruption. By the following morning, state media was running the broadcast hack not as evidence of regime vulnerability but as evidence of regime persecution. The airstrikes, the satellite intercept, the financial system attacks, the simultaneous multi-domain pressure that had been designed to demonstrate the Islamic Republic's fragility were being repackaged in real time as proof of the scope of foreign aggression against Iran. Not against the IRGC, not against the Supreme Leader, against Iran. The man in the office had a specific word for this dynamic, a word he had used in the third abort session, and that had not, in retrospect, been given enough weight. The word was gift. Every operation that Israel conducted in this period, regardless of its tactical success, was a potential gift to the Iranian government's domestic narrative. A bomb on a radar installation was a gift. A hack on a cryptocurrency exchange was a gift. A satellite signal carrying footage of women marching was, depending on how the recipient processed it, either a crack in the lie or confirmation that the enemy was inside the signal itself, trying to use their screens against them. The man in the office had known this. He had accepted it as a manageable risk. In the 72-hour window, it did not look manageable. It looked like the dominant outcome. There was a secondary intelligence stream that arrived on day 3. It did not come through official channels. It came through a network of human sources inside Iran, the kind of network that is never fully described in any document that will ever be declassified, whose existence is confirmed only by the occasional reference and reporting by people who know how to read around what they are not being told. What the secondary stream showed was this. In at least 3 cities, individuals had been detained in the 48 hours following the broadcast. The detentions were not publicly announced. They were not linked, in any official Iranian communication, to the satellite hack. The man in the office believed they were linked. He had no way to prove it. He had no way to know how many there were beyond the 3 confirmed cases. He had no way to know what the detention conditions were, what the individuals had done, whether their connection to the broadcast was direct or incidental, or the result of being in the wrong place when a security service that was already on high alert decided to demonstrate that it was paying attention. He had authorized a signal that reached every satellite receiver in the country. He was now looking at 3 names. He understood that 3 names was not the number. It was the number he could see. The internal fracture, when it came, was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. No one resigned. No one sent a formal objection through whatever channel formal objections travel in organizations that do not officially exist. It was quieter than that. It was a conversation, in a corridor, between the man in the office and someone whose role in the operation had been upstream, one of the people who had built the signal architecture, who had made the intercept technically possible, who had sat in all 3 abort sessions and voted. Both times it came to a vote, to proceed. The person in the corridor said something that the man in the office would think about for a long time afterward. They said, "We designed the signal to reach everyone. We should have known that everyone includes the people who are most visible." the ones the government is already watching. We sent the message to the population, but the population isn't uniform. The people who respond to it first are the people who were already at the edge, and the people at the edge are the ones with the least protection. The man in the office did not disagree. He said, "We knew that." The person in the corridor said, "Knowing it and designing around it are different things." They walked in opposite directions. Neither of them raised the conversation in any formal session. Here is what the operational brief had not fully accounted for. The broadcast was designed to work on a population that was ready to move, a population sitting at the threshold of action, needing only evidence that the information environment had been breached, that the signal was no longer sovereign, that the lie had been visibly exposed. The brief assumed that population existed in sufficient numbers in June 2025 to produce visible, destabilizing pressure on the regime. The brief was based on intelligence assessments of Iranian public sentiment. Those assessments were based on intercepts, on human intelligence, on the kind of indirect inference that is the only methodology available when the country you are assessing has shut down every transparent channel through which sentiment normally flows. What those assessments could not fully model was the distance between private anger and public action in a country where the cost of that translation had, for decades, been paid in imprisonment and blood. The people of Iran were angry. The assessments had that right. They were also, in June 2025, exhausted, 3 years out from the Massa Amini protests, living inside an economy in freefall, watching a military campaign against their country's infrastructure and being told daily that the enemy wanted them dead. The signal had reached them. What it had not done, what the man in the office was now sitting with, in the silence of the 72-hour window, was give them something the signal alone could not provide, a reason to believe that this time would be different from every other time, that if they went outside, something would be waiting for them other than what had always been waiting. He did not know how to transmit that through a satellite. He was not sure it could be transmitted at all. The question that sat on his desk unanswered was not whether the operation had worked. It was whether it had reached the right moment, or whether it had arrived 6 months too early, into a country that was not yet at the edge, and had simply told the government exactly how far Israel was willing to go, and given them the time to prepare for what came next. The second operation was not planned in June. It became necessary in December. On December 28, 2025, shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar pulled their shutters down and did not open them. Not as a protest, initially, as a refusal. The rial had lost 1/3 of its value in the 6 months since the Rising Lion campaign. A shopkeeper who had priced his inventory in rials in May was, by December, selling at a loss that no margin could absorb. The shutters came down because the numbers no longer worked. Not because of courage, because of arithmetic. The man in the office watched the intelligence feed that morning and felt something he had not felt in months. He thought, "This is it. This is the threshold. He was wrong." But he would not know that for another 11 days. The operational team reassembled quickly. The signal architecture from June was still intact, not deployed, but maintained, the way certain capabilities are kept at a specific readiness level that has a technical designation no one uses in casual conversation. The discussion in the first session was brief. The economic collapse was real. The protests spreading from the bazaar into residential streets in Tehran, then Mossad, then Isfahan, then 30 cities simultaneously, that was real. The intelligence picture showed something that the June picture had not: genuine cross-class participation. Not just students, not just the chronically politicized, shopkeepers, teachers, people who had never attended a protest in their lives and were now outside because the thing that had finally broken them was not ideology. It was the price of cooking oil. The man in the office believed, in the first session, that they were looking at a revolution. He said so, directly, in a room where people do not usually say things directly. He said, "This is different from June. June was pressure from outside landing on a population that wasn't ready. This is pressure from inside. We are not the cause of this. We are watching something that is already moving." What he did not say, but what sat in the room with everyone present, was the implication of that framing. If the movement was already moving, a signal would not need to start it. It would only need to reach it. The distinction seemed important in December. It would become complicated later. The first broadcast attempt was scheduled for January 3rd. It did not happen. The technical window opened at 9:47 p.m. Tehran time. The uplink was established. The signal was queued. The footage, the same architecture as June, protest imagery, the call to the streets, the logo was ready. At 9:51 p.m., 4 minutes into the window, the operator running the uplink reported an anomaly in the frequency confirmation. Not a technical failure. Something stranger, the satellite receiver pattern across Tehran was showing irregular distribution. A cluster of receivers in 2 specific districts had gone offline in the previous 6 hours. Not all receivers, not a blackout, a cluster. The man in the office looked at the geographic overlay and understood what he was seeing before anyone said it aloud. The IRGC had moved people. In the 6 hours before the broadcast window, the Iranian security services had physically relocated personnel, or their families, or both, out of 2 specific residential districts, which meant either they had anticipated the broadcast, or they were running a security operation in those districts for an unrelated reason, or the relocation was coincidental. 3 options. No way to determine which. The man in the office said, "Abort." No one argued. The signal went dark at 9:53 p.m. The window closed. The uplink was stood down. They sat with the anomaly for 4 days. On January 7th, the intelligence picture changed. The protests had not subsided in the 6 days since the bizarre strikes began. They had grown. The cross-class participation that the man in the office had noted in the first session was now joined by something that the analytical team had not predicted with confidence: visible participation by people associated with the professional military. Not the IRGC, the conventional army. Soldiers, or people who appeared to be soldiers, in footage circulating through the diaspora networks via Starlink uplinks. Not armed, not in formation, standing in streets, not firing. The secondary intelligence stream, the human network that had shown him 3 names in June, was now showing him a different kind of signal. Not detentions, conversations. Officers talking to each other about orders they had not yet received, but expected to receive. The man in the office read the summary and felt the thing he had felt on December 28th, but differently. Not "this is it." Something more careful than that. He felt the signal has a specific target now, not the population, the people with the guns. He called the second session. The content of the January broadcast was different from June in one significant way. June had been aimed at the population generally. Footage of protests, a call to the streets. The implicit message: the government lied to you, and we can reach you past the lie. January was aimed at the security forces specifically. The graphics were precise. The language was direct. Do not turn your weapons on the people. Join the nation. The Crown Prince footage was chosen not for its political symbolism. Reza Pahlavi's support inside Iran was genuinely unknown, a variable that made several people in the room uncomfortable, but because it provided a face, a human anchor for the message. Something that made the broadcast feel like a communication rather than a slogan. The man in the office had a specific concern about the Crown Prince footage. He raised it in the session and was told that the decision had been made at a level above his. He noted his concern in the session record and did not raise it again. His concern was this: the footage presupposed a political outcome. It was not just saying stop shooting. It was saying stop shooting, and here is what comes after. And the man in the office was not confident, was not close to confident, that the security forces watching the broadcast would process those two messages as separable. That they would hear stop shooting and set aside here is what comes after as a separate question for a later moment. He thought they would hear both simultaneously, and that for a significant number of them, here is what comes after would be the thing that determined whether they listened to stop shooting at all. He had noted his concern. The decision had been made above him. He authorized the uplink. The broadcast went out on January 18th at 11:23 p.m. Tehran time. Across multiple channels simultaneously, a wider footprint than June, technically more complex, requiring coordination across more than one transmission point. It ran for longer than June, not 8 seconds, closer to 40. In the room where the man in the office was sitting, 40 seconds felt like a duration that had its own weight. 40 seconds is long enough to watch something, to hear it, to process a significant portion of it before the slate comes back. At approximately the 30-second mark, the monitoring feed showed something that produced, in the room, what the man in the office would later describe to the person in the corridor as a false release. The social media uplinks, the Starlink terminals that diaspora networks were using to pull footage out of Iran through the internet blackout, started carrying clips of the broadcast. Within 30 seconds of the signal going out, fragments were appearing on X on Telegram, distributed by accounts connected to the Pahlavi campaign. The clips were real. The broadcast had reached receivers. People were watching it. People were capturing it and transmitting it outward through the only channel still functioning. Someone in the room said, "It's working." The man in the office did not respond. He was looking at a different part of the monitoring feed. The internet shutdown that the Iranian government had implemented on January 8th, 10 days earlier, at the start of the crackdown, had not been lifted. The clips were escaping through Starlink. But inside Iran, the people watching the broadcast had no access to what was escaping. They were seeing the 40 seconds. They were not seeing the diaspora response. They were not seeing the international coverage beginning to accumulate. They were seeing the Crown Prince and the message to the soldiers, and then the IRIB slate returning, and then whatever the government chose to say about it next. The broadcast had reached them. What it had reached them inside of was a blackout. The man in the office understood, in that moment, something about the operation that the brief had not adequately confronted. A signal that arrives inside a blackout does not function the same way as a signal that arrives inside a functioning information environment. In a functioning environment, the broadcast would be one input among many, corroborated, contextualized, amplified or undermined by other sources, by neighbor conversations, by the visible behavior of people who had also seen it. Inside a blackout, it was the only thing. And the only thing, when the state controls everything that follows it, is not freedom. It is a single data point that the state immediately moves to reinterpret, surround, and own. The man in the office had designed the signal for a population with information. He had delivered it to a population in the dark. The room was still watching the diaspora clips multiply on the external feed. He did not say what he was thinking. He was thinking about January 8th and 9th, 10 days earlier, before the broadcast, before his operation, before anyone in this room had decided anything. He was thinking about what had already happened on those 2 days, inside the blackout, before the signal arrived, and he was not yet ready to complete the thought. The consequences did not wait for the operation to finish. They were already present on January 8th and 9th, 10 days before the broadcast, in the hours the man in the office had been thinking about but not completing. The days when the Iranian security apparatus, reading the trajectory of the protests, made a decision that no satellite signal could have anticipated or prevented. They shut the internet down. Then they moved. What happened on January 8th and 9th is documented, incompletely, through the fragments that escaped before the blackout was total. Security forces, IRGC battalions, Bassage units, plainclothes agents moved through protest sites in Tehran and in at least 15 other cities simultaneously. The sequencing was not reactive. It was planned. The scale was not crowd control. It was something that required a different category of language. And the organizations that deal in that language, Amnesty International, the UN Special Rapporteur, Iran International, applied it in the weeks that followed, when the fragments had accumulated into something that could be assessed. By the time the January 18th broadcast aired, the worst of the killing had already happened. The man in the office knew this. He had known it before the second session, before the uplink was authorized, before the 40 seconds of Crown Prince footage and soldier-targeted graphics went out across multiple satellite channels simultaneously. He had authorized it anyway, because the killing had not stopped, because the security forces were still in the streets, because the theory, reach the soldiers, show them a different choice, had not expired simply because it had arrived late. But late is not neutral. Late changes what a signal means. The immediate fallout arrived in two streams, and they contradicted each other in a way that made assessment almost impossible. The first stream was the diaspora signal, the Starlink clips, the international coverage, the accumulation of attention from governments and human rights organizations and press outlets that had been trying to see inside the blackout for 10 days and now had 40 seconds of footage to work with. The broadcast gave the outside world a frame. It made visible, in a transmissible form, that someone had reached inside Iran's information environment and spoken directly to the security forces. Amnesty International's reporting, the UN Special Rapporteur's statement, the international coverage that peaked in the week following the broadcast, none of it was caused by the broadcast. The killing had happened before it, but the broadcast gave the outside attention a specific, visual, transmissible anchor. A moment that could be shared. A moment that said, "This is what is being contested." The man in the office understood this outcome. He had not designed for it. It was a consequence of the operation's visibility, not its intent. The second stream was harder. The secondary intelligence network, the human sources inside Iran, began returning information in the days after the broadcast that followed the same pattern as June, but with greater volume. Detentions. Not of protesters in the streets who were being detained in numbers that had long since exceeded the network's ability to track. Specific detentions. People connected, in ways the man in the office could not fully reconstruct, to the broadcast itself. People who had responded to it visibly, who had said something, or done something, or been seen doing something in the hours after the 40 seconds appeared on their screen. The Iranian government had called the broadcast a Mossad operation within hours of its airing. The speed of that attribution was itself information. It meant they were not surprised. It meant they had been expecting something like this, had been, in the period since June, preparing a response framework for exactly this category of operation. The man in the office read the attribution speed and understood the implication. They had not reached the soldiers before the government reached them first. The long-term strategic consequence of the two broadcasts, June and January, 6 months apart, the same capability deployed into two entirely different contexts, was not the one the operational brief had been written to produce. The brief had described a theory of cascading pressure. Each breach of the information environment would accumulate. Each demonstration that the signal was not sovereign would compound. The population would move from private anger to public action as the evidence accumulated that the lie was visible, that the government could not contain the truth. What accumulated instead was a different kind of learning, on both sides. The Iranian government had spent the 6 months between June and January studying the satellite intercept methodology, not to replicate it, to counter it. The irregular receiver distribution that had triggered the January 3rd abort, the anomaly that had made the man in the office pull the signal before it went out, that was not coincidental. The IRGC's signals intelligence apparatus had been working on the problem since June. They could not prevent the signal, but they were learning to identify the window, to move their most visible assets out of documented coverage zones before the intercept could reach them. The June broadcast had taught the Iranian government something about Israeli capability. Capability, once demonstrated, is also a lesson to the adversary. The January broadcast taught them something more specific, that the second operation would target security forces directly, that the psychological operations component of Israeli pressure would, in a genuine domestic crisis, attempt to fracture the loyalty of the apparatus rather than inflame the population. The IRGC spent the weeks after January preparing for a third broadcast that did not come. But the preparation was real. The methodology was being countered. The window was narrowing. The capability had been used twice. Its future utility had been spent in proportion. The institutional cost was structural and slow. It did not arrive as a formal reckoning. There was no inquiry, no published assessment, no named official held to account for a decision that had produced outcomes that the operational brief had not fully modeled. What arrived instead was a quieter form of cost, a set of questions that the institution now had to carry without being able to answer them publicly, or in most cases privately. The question of the 3 names from June and the larger number from January, the people who had been detained in the windows following the broadcasts, could not be processed through any official channel. There was no mechanism for an intelligence organization to account for the civilian cost of a psychological operation in a country with a closed information environment and no independent judiciary. The names existed in the secondary intelligence stream. They did not exist in any document that would ever be reviewed. The man in the office carried them anyway. Not as guilt, guilt implies a clarity about causation that the situation did not offer. As weight. The specific weight of knowing that your signal reached a room and not knowing what happened in the room after it arrived. He had designed for a population. The population was made of individuals. He had always known this, and it had never fully resolved into something actionable. The personal cost was less visible than the institutional one, and more permanent. The person he had spoken to in the corridor, the one who had said that knowing and designing around are different things, had not been wrong. The man in the office had known that the signal would reach the most visible people first, the ones already at the edge, the ones with the least protection. He had authorized it anyway in June, because the alternative was silence during a campaign that was designed to show the Iranian government's vulnerability. He had authorized it again in January because the alternative was silence during a massacre. Both of those decisions had a coherent logic. He could reconstruct the logic cleanly, in sequence, from the available evidence with the information that was present at each moment of decision. What he could not do was determine whether the coherent logic had been right, not because the outcomes were unclear, because the counterfactual, the version of June and January in which the broadcasts never happened, was permanently inaccessible. He could not know what Iran looked like in a world where the signal had stayed quiet. Whether the killing in January was shaped by the June broadcast's failure to produce a revolution, which had hardened the regime's confidence. Whether the soldiers who did not defect would have defected without the Crown Prince footage making the ask feel political rather than purely human. whether 3 names and an unknown larger number had paid a price that the silence would not have extracted. He could not know. He would not know. This is the position that people who authorize undirected signals occupy permanently. Not resolution, not closure. The specific condition of having made a consequential decision in incomplete ethical clarity, and then living in the space where the full consequences remain, and will remain unmeasured. What the 2 broadcasts produced, in the end, was a record. Not of success or failure, of what was attempted, of what was considered and what was not, of what the signal reached and what it could not. The record exists in fragments, in secondary intelligence streams, in diaspora archives, in reporting by organizations that piece together what escaped through Starlink terminals while the internet was dark. It does not answer the question the man in the office was sitting with. It does not answer the question you are sitting with now. That is not an accident. That is the nature of the thing.